So I wanted, before we get started, to let everyone know that I have a new podcast out, and it's called Meditations. If you like the Meditations segment of this current podcast, you'll like the Meditations podcast. It's nothing but 20 minutes of meditative sounds. And now, on with the podcast.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Caesar's Palace for 12 rounds of boxing. In the red corner, from Los Angeles, California, wearing the red trunks with the gold trim, weighing in at 125 pounds, the lightweight champion of the world, Danny Little Red Lopez. Well, Bill, our winners get a home theater receiver. That's right. Experience the full potential of high-definition video with this 72-channel digital home theater receiver from Yamaha. But wait, that's not all. They also get a 5.1-channel surround sound system from Mirage. With 5 palm-sized speakers and a compact subwoofer cube, the MX 5.1 brings you huge immersive sound with Mirage's omnipolar technology. All from the Spiegel catalog, Chicago, Illinois, 60609. And they're taking closer order as down the stretch they come. Mr. Hot Stuff has 3 lengths to make up with chocolate candy last. On the rail, take the points behind that gallant son with chocolate candy gaining on the outside. In the lead is Pioneer of the Nile being tackled by chocolate candy. They're neck and neck as they come to the wire. And Pioneer of the Nile holds off chocolate candy and wins the Santa Anita Derby. And now, on your feet, time to greet holder of 14 NBA titles, your home team, your Los Angeles Lakers. Number 3 at 6'8", 5th year out of UCLA, playing forward, Trevor Ariza. Starting at center, number 17 at 7 feet, 4th year out of St. Andrews High School, Andrew Bynum. And at guard, number 24, 6'6", 13th season out of Loyal Marion High School, Kobe Bryant.
Hooters is going out of business because they were injecting fake hormones and genetically modifying their ingredients. Can't imagine what they were doing to the food.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Rules Saturday, July the 5th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we'll have No Free Lunch, effective interpersonal communications, rules for retrogrades, the sovereign child, motivation, meditation, and psychopolitics. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now, there's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
Many well-meaning people favor legal minimum wage rates in the mistaken belief that they help the poor. These people confuse wage rates with wage income. It has always been a mystery to me to understand why a youngster is better off unemployed at $1.60 an hour than employed at $1.25. Milton Friedman. Our concern should be on the income of our labor force, money actually received by workers. The rate reflects something entirely different than the income. 10 people receiving $100 is more income than 7 people receiving $120. This is mere math, but it is also pure economics.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, effective interpersonal communications, method 20, play dumb, also known as the Is That So method. Don't try to think you know everything. Don't try to know what your opponent is trying to say more than he manages to explain to you. Otherwise, you would be favoring your opponent's case. Something means that you want it to mean, not what somebody else wants it to mean. Many times, just because we know the meaning of what somebody is saying, we feel our facial expressions start getting out of control. Even when we know the other person is wrongly accusing us, we look guilty. If there only was a way to trick our mind into thinking it had forgotten the language. Let's see an example. Somebody's murdered. One of your so-called friends says, acting innocent, "When he was killed, you were found outside the room with a knife, right?" Now, this is a clear implication that you might be the murderer. But the fact is, everybody knows that you were using a knife in the other room to butter your bread. In fact, it wasn't even a proper knife, but a butter knife. Now, in such a situation, even though you know your having the knife has nothing to do with the murder, it wasn't even a proper knife and it didn't have the blood of the victim on it, because your frenemy makes it sound like you're a suspect in front of other people, you feel awkward and become confused as to what to say. If you say nothing, people might suspect you. But if you start justifying yourself and start mentioning all the details as to how your holding the knife is completely unrelated to the murder, you feel awkward knowing the person already knows you are innocent. You become confused about whether you should address your frenemy or the other bystanders, or both. On the other hand, there are many people who, even if they know they are in the wrong, refuse to admit their mistake even to themselves and don't feel any guilt or shame for what they have done. They either stubbornly refuse to acknowledge they might have done anything wrong or might laugh when you tell them to feel ashamed of themselves. They play dumb to what others are saying and think only what they want to think, not what others want them to think. This is not to say that you should become completely shameless and not feel any guilt for what you have done wrong. The reason I've added this method to this book is so that you realize that even if you merely feel guilty, it should be for some logical reason. You must have done something you feel is wrong to feel guilty. You shouldn't feel guilty just because somebody else thinks you should. So, how do you apply this method? Well, for starters, you have to keep an alert mind and focus on your version of things. Secondly, you have to apply the criticize question method and question the truth and validity of everything your opponent is saying. And everything means everything. In the above situation, you can say something like, I wasn't in the room when the murder happened, and a butter knife is not a real knife. You know all the details. What is it that you're trying to say? Let's see another event where this method proved helpful to somebody. Randy worked at a chemical factory. One of the products they used to make at the factory was reinforced plastic pipes. The process for this involved dipping relatively weaker plastics into a chemical solution. After leaving the pipes there for a few hours, the solution congealed onto the pipes, making them stronger. The problem that occurred here was that they had to wait for the solution to harden. Not only did this take several hours, but later they had to spend another hour trying to break the solidified liquid from the pipe with care, leaving behind only the necessary amount in the correct shape. Not only did this take up a lot of time and resources, but the pipes thus produced were naturally very costly due to the long and difficult process to make them. Recently, A thinning chemical had been introduced in the plastic industry abroad. Using this chemical, there would be no excess hardened liquid that would need to be broken. Only a limited layer would cover the pipe, just like paint. This way, many more pipes could be produced in a limited time and space. Randy had informed the factory owner of this and suggested they import the thinner before any competitors did. However, the factory owner was opposed to this plan. He was concerned that doing so would mean his workers wouldn't be able to work as many hours as before and hence would receive less pay. They would then start leaving work to find jobs elsewhere. To increase work hours, he might need to import more raw material than necessary, and it wouldn't get sold. He was also sure no competitors would ever dream of importing the thinner and upsetting their regular business operations. Randy insisted that it was such a good business opportunity that the factory owner was letting go. He even went so far as to say that if the factory owner wouldn't change his stance, he would set up his own factory. On hearing this, the factory owner adopted a gangster stance, and in a threatening manner strictly forbade Randy from pursuing the matter further. In fact, he became so paranoid he started following Randy to see if he was indeed starting his own business. One day, he saw Randy talking to a foreign man in a restaurant. He immediately had the suspicion that this was a foreign investor and that Randy was closing a business deal. When the foreigner left and Randy was about to leave the restaurant, the owner approached him with a group of his gangsters and said menacingly, "What do you think you're doing?" Now, here is normally where our guilty conscience kicks in. When we are doing something we know somebody disapproves of, we feel uncomfortable when that person sees us doing it. We feel as if we are accountable to him. But we need to realize we don't owe anybody the favor of giving up our beliefs just because they say so, no more than they owe it to us. Now, let's see how Randy can play dumb. One way Randy could answer the question would be to say, "I was meeting a friend." Okay, that's acceptable. Nothing wrong with saying that, but it still reflects his inner guilty voice. It shows that he's scared of what the other person is thinking, even if the factory owner doesn't notice it. He's trying to provide justification for his actions. The aim of playing dumb is to not worry about what anybody else thinks about your actions. So it would be better for Randy to respond with something like, "What do you mean? I'm just walking. It's not like I'm blocking your way." In order to play dumb, you have to completely forget and ignore whatever you think the other person is trying to say. You have to focus on thinking that you don't understand what the other person is trying to say. The purpose of using this method is to stop your opponent from getting you to make his side of the argument and getting you to say we live on Mars just because he believes we do. So, rather than feeling pressured into agreeing with your opponent's beliefs, you get to say what you want to say by playing dumb. And that was method 20, playing dumb, from the book, Effective Interpersonal Communications. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades.
Rule 40. Victory loves preparation. This is perhaps both the most fundamental of the rules for retrogrades and the most crucial. It is nothing short of pure hubris to think that we stand any chance of winning a fight against a competent opponent for which we are not adequately prepared. Leading up to a bout, boxers spend months in training camps, immersed in fitness routines, sparring with fighters chosen based on their physical and technical similarity to the upcoming opponent. Before a match, chess masters spend weeks poring over the opening choices, stylistic preferences, and prior games of their rivals. Generals meticulously study the tactics and methods of opposing generals. General Patton, in the run-up to the North Africa campaign in World War II, famously read Erwin Rommel's book, Infantry Attacks. Football coaches sit down weekly to watch film of their upcoming opponents, to get familiar with their roster strengths and playbooks. Why mod cons believe for a second that they have a snowflake's chance in hell of whooping an organized, bankrolled, determined group of radicals just by showing up at the polls every 2 years and perhaps bloviating to insolent nieces and nephews about politics over Thanksgiving dinner is one of the unsolved mysteries of the universe. Too many mod cons earnestly think that because they're nominally on the side of the good, Providence has all but guaranteed them victory in the political cultural wars. Too many mod cons believe that their only duty to their fellow men is to be productive members of society, hold down a steady job, produce a milquetoast family without getting a divorce, harm no one, perhaps go to church on Sunday, and develop acceptably partisan political opinions. They've got another think coming. While victory rests with the Lord, the horse is to be made ready for the day of battle. Living an uninspired, ennui-filled, suburban existence, replete with creature comforts of every sort, doesn't lend itself to wresting control of the West away from radicals, hell-bent on destroying it. As marvelous Marvin Hagler famously quipped, "It's tough to get out of bed to do road work at 5 a.m. when you've been sleeping in silk pajamas." Taking a generally passive approach to the pressing issues of our day, albeit with the tired rationalization that one wants to help but doesn't have time to get involved, is really just sterilized treason against the retrograde cause. What we need is active and uncompromising engagement, and this takes preparation. How can retrogrades prepare themselves to fight and win the political cultural wars? First, we must take great pains to prepare ourselves intellectually for ideological combat. The retrograde must be well versed in classical works of Western political thought, in the philosophy of natural rights and limited government, in the justifications for the free market, in the social kingship of Jesus Christ, and in the doctrines of Christianity. In order to do battle, one must know with great specificity the objectives of the fight, especially when the battle is to take place in the realm of ideas. Achieving a foundational knowledge of the retrograde philosophy is condition precedent for jumping into the fray. Without it, our engagement would be directionless and flailing, and we'd suffer significant attrition to radicals. And no, watching Tucker Carlson every night isn't sufficient either, although God bless him. Once the retrograde has a foundational understanding of his own worldview, then he must think about taking a more active role in seizing the culture. Seasoning his knowledge with prudence, the retrograde should identify what he believes to be the most pressing issues of the day, and it's okay and even salutary to have some variation here. He then needs to band together with other retrogrades interested in advocating those priority issues and form a group, or join one if a suitable one already exists. The retrograde must make a firm and realistic pledge of his time to the group going forward. It is insufficient to conditionally give time when it can be worked into the margins of one's schedule. The present state of cultural decay does not admit of dilettantism. Once the retrograde has involved himself with like-minded men, he and his companions must come up with a proposal for making headway on the identified issue, for ushering in the retrograde vision. Once a proposal is agreed upon, it should be formalized and written into an agenda with specific dates and times assigned for specific actions. The retrograde compatriots must continue to meet and should make every attempt to bring additional friends and acquaintances to their meetings so as to swell our numbers. For every retrograde issue, there must be permanent retrograde organization. This is the only efficacious sort of political involvement. Showing up at the polls and making idle chatter about politics is assumed. It's necessary, but not sufficient. The retrograde must also become a student of radicalism. Not only must he be well versed in his own literature, the retrograde must be just as well versed in radicals' literature. He must know precisely what it is that the radical believes and why the radical believes it. One is badly and unnecessarily handicapped in trying to fight an enemy that he doesn't quite understand. If retrogrades settle for a superficial knowledge of radicals' goals, we will never understand why it is that radicals do what they do as they're doing it. We'll never understand the method, the uniting cause underlying what might appear to the untrained eye as random and unconnected planks in their platform. One can only fight an enemy effectively when he understands the enemy's overarching goals. It's why America's policy of containment really did prove effective in bringing down communism. Our generals knew that, of its very nature, communism could not survive if it were not a worldwide system. It could not perdure if relegated to nation-states alone. Hence, by curtailing its spread, we were able to have it wither from inside out. We must apply the same general principle in defeating radicalism, understand its meta-strategy and its sine qua nons, and sketch out a way to sabotage it, like the Star Wars Rebel Alliance analyzing the Death Star plans to find and exploit a weakness. The foregoing are all mere examples of preparatory steps that retrogrades must take in advance of their entry into the political cultural wars. If we are to prevail, we must out-prepare and outwork our ideological enemy. We must eschew the complacency and passivity of modcons, which was at its zenith when the boomers lost the culture for us in the first place 50 years ago. If we inculcate discipline and commit ourselves to the tough path ahead, we give ourselves the chance to remake the West into a shining beacon on a hill.
And that was rule number 40 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy J. and David R. Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now from the Sovereign Child, and we're still in the chapter about the philosophical underpinnings of this theory for child rearing, if you will. And this section is called Popper and Parenting. One of Karl Popper's famous maxims is that all life is problem solving. Parenting is teaching children how to live, which means how to solve problems. Fortunately, children have the same problem-solving engine that adults have, a mind that produces guesses and can work through criticisms internally. In fact, this creative guessing machine tends to be more active in children because they have not yet learned to be ashamed of their guesses, to mistrust them, or to self-censor them. To be sure, children are ignorant to the background knowledge that adults have, but that's what childhood is. The process of building up sufficient background knowledge so that they don't need an adult to take care of them. Consider this thought experiment to drive the point home. Imagine a 9-year-old who's figured out how to make money by doing odd jobs for the neighbors, like mowing lawns and doing housework. Imagine he earns enough to pay for his own needs, that he likes to buy and prepare his own food, clothes, and personal effects. We can imagine that he came up with this idea from watching a YouTuber who earns a living doing the same. Imagine another YouTuber gets him interested in coding, and he develops some basic skills by using various games and apps that teach coding. Imagine he apprentices with a local company to apply what he's learned and has the rudiments of a career track in front of him. Imagine that he is also interested in emotional mastery, and he follows a YouTuber who teaches techniques for avoiding getting overly emotional. Imagine he regularly seeks your advice on all of these matters and takes it to heart. He readily tells you about the things that are strange or worrisome to him, and when you identify something dangerous, he takes this seriously and investigates strategies to avoid it. If he has money, if he can get around on a bike or ride public transportation or even hail rides with Uber, if he has an idea for a reliable career, if he can feed and clothe himself, and if he has discernment about dangerous things and trusted people to talk to, he can function as an adult. What I'm describing sounds like a kind of general-purpose prodigy only because our culture doesn't allow children to make so much progress on their own. But there's nothing in principle preventing a 9-year-old from becoming a functioning adult. If the boy attains the requisite knowledge to solve new problems as they arise, which he can, just as any other person can, then there's nothing stopping him. If raising a child is a matter of supporting the child's knowledge acquisition, then getting the right theory of knowledge is crucial. Parenting is applied epistemology. We now have a philosophical basis for the kind of parenting described in this book. Specifically, we should avoid the pitfalls of bad epistemology, justificationism, and appeal to the strengths of good epistemology, Popper's critical rationalism. So in this particular, he says, consider this thought experiment to drive the point home. Imagine this, imagine that, imagine the other thing. The question then is why? Why should we consider this particular thought experiment? Why is this the thought experiment to be considered? It reminds me of the E equals MC squared situation with Einstein. There was they used a thought experiment where they apparently Einstein came up with this whole theory based on the speed of light as being the cosmic speed limit. And he said that imagine if all of a sudden the sun disappeared and immediately all of the planets would begin to fall away because of the gravitational pull of the sun is no longer there. But there's a problem because then the rays of the sun, it takes them 7 minutes to reach Earth. So how can we have this situation where the rays of the sun are taking 7 minutes to get to Earth, but if you shut off the gravity, immediately all of the planets are going to start falling away? Again, the speed of light being the cosmic thing. But the key word in this thing is imagine. The question is, why do we imagine that? Has any such thing ever occurred where something just simply vanishes? No. So the other thing is he's claiming that in other words, that the speed of gravity is faster than the speed of light. Well, how do we know? How do we know that if the sun disappears, that number one, that all the light isn't just going to disappear at exactly the same time? Secondly, how do we know that gravity, the force of gravity, isn't going to continue on for another 7, 8, 10 minutes or whatever? How do we know? We don't. It's a self-serving example. It's an example designed to create a problem that really doesn't exist. And so it's the same thing here with the Popper argument. He or she is trying to create, the author is creating a problem that really doesn't exist. They're solving a problem that doesn't exist with Sovereign Child. So let me see. What else? There was something else in here. Let's see. No, well, about producing guesses and works through inner criticisms internally. And that's what childhood is, the process of building up sufficient background knowledge so they don't need an adult to take care of them. But that's the whole role for adults, really, is to provide kids with shortcuts. The book is, and the author is still saying that the kids need to be left to their own devices, learn by hitting every pothole in the road. But it's not necessary. It's not necessary. We have parents that have done these things. Parents that have gone ahead and mowed lawns for a living, or sold avocados or oranges door to door, or had a paper route, or whatever, and can provide the child with the benefit of their knowledge and experience. So otherwise, what you end up with is a situation where, again, the parents become nothing more than hotel keepers. So anyways, that was that section of the chapter about the philosophical underpinnings of this book. And next time, the bucket theory of knowledge. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little bit of meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit of motivation. And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Europe 1.
Il y a un tabou en plus très culpabilisant pour les femmes quand même. Moi je l'ai vu chez ma femme et dans la manière dont le gynécologue s'est comporté. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a un côté vous allez en faire un autre. Comme si en fait c'était une machine en fait. Et quand on est l'accompagnant, parce que le papa il est concerné mais il n'est qu'accompagnant, il y a un autre tabou aussi, je sais pas, les hommes osent pas trop en parler. Elle s'est rendu compte que finalement elle était peut-être tombée enceinte surtout pour me faire plaisir. Et moi je préfère faire confiance au réel d'une femme que j'aime. Plutôt que d'essayer de me dire je vais avoir un enfant, je me fantasme père, essayer de trouver quelqu'un qui aurait le bon âge ou qui voudrait ou je ne sais pas quoi. Surtout que moi je suis tout le temps en tournée etc, donc je me rêve père mais finalement je suis un étourdi atteint d'une Pierre Richardite assez aiguë. J'ai quand même pas mal de tout ça, donc si finalement c'était avoir ça, mettre la pression à quelqu'un qui n'en veut pas, surtout pas. La vie des fois vous cogne et des fois vous offre des surprises extraordinaires, donc je n'ai pas complètement fermé la porte et j'essaye. Il est dans un coin, mais je ne m'y réchauffe pas les mains, quoi. Mais je le laisse allumer.
Est-ce que ça ressemble à une forme de deuil, ça?
C'est un deuil, oui, c'est complètement. Il y a deux deuils. Il y a le deuil du moment de la fausse couche, et ensuite il y a le double deuil du moment où je m'aperçois, et elle s'aperçoit aussi, parce que ça n'a pas été le cas tout de suite, que clairement c'est plus possible pour elle, en tout cas.
And that was Europe 1. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, what does the phrase, if you're explaining you're losing, mean in debates? This was said by Ronald Reagan, speaking of political campaigns. From the perspective of your audience, if you have to explain yourself, you come off looking desperate to convince. As a consequence, you lose the high ground. From a more philosophical perspective, when you have a clear conscience and strong conviction towards the positions you take, your values, truth, and direction, you don't need the opinions or consent of others. As a consequence, you don't need to explain yourself. However, if you yourself are not convinced of the validity and truth of your position, or you can't fully justify your choices, then you continue to expel words in an attempt to create the illusion of certainty. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now from a book that's called Good Inside. What's the opposite of understanding? For this argument's sake, it's convincing. Convincing is the attempt to prove a singular reality, to prove that only one thing is true. Convincing is an attempt to be right, and as a result make the other person wrong. It rests on the assumption that there's only one correct viewpoint. And then my question is this supposed to be convincing? Further, convincing has one goal in mind, being right. And here's the unfortunate consequence of being right. The other person feels unseen and unheard, at which point most people become infuriated and combative, because it feels as if the other person does not accept your realness or worth. Feeling unseen and unheard makes connection impossible. Understanding two things are true and convincing one thing is true are diametrically opposed ways of approaching other people, so a powerful first step in any interaction is to notice which mode you're in. When you're in one thing is true mode, you're judgmental of and reactive to someone else's experience because it feels like an assault on your own truth. As a result, you will seek to prove your own point of view, which in turn makes the other person defensive because they need to uphold the realness of their experience. In one thing is true mode, exchanges escalate quickly. Each person thinks they're arguing about the content of the conversation when in fact they're trying to defend that they are a real, worthy person with a real, truthful experience. And again, is this convincing? Back in a minute. Thank you. Now the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Back in a minute. Thank you. So apparently we're done with psychopolitics. So instead, I'm going to go ahead and do the next chapter of Rules for Patriots.
Chapter 6. Commandment number 5. Reverse the premise of your opponent's argument and use it against him. How many times have you watched the presidential debates in the post-Reagan years with your hands half covering your eyes, just dreading that moment when that gotcha question comes our guy's way? You can almost sense it coming too, can't you? Just when our guy seems to have the momentum and a head of steam, you know the liberal media member pretending to be an impartial moderator is going to drop the proverbial hammer right on our heads. Come on. I can't be the only grassroots conservative out there who has experienced this level of angst watching these things. Be honest with me now. Don't leave me hanging. That's what I thought. I mean, heaven forbid our Republican champion actually has the worldview and shrewd communication skills to turn the question to his advantage. I mean, we're only running for the highest office in the land here, so it's not like we should expect the best of the best to represent us or anything. At this point, our expectations are so low, we'd settle for our Republican champion to just stop ceding even more ground to the left, let alone taking some back. Too often while watching the campaigns of establishment candidates, our guy actually tries to get to the left of the questioner instead of standing up to him. For instance, you knew the 2008 campaign was over when John McCain mavericked himself all the way to the left of Barack Obama during the bailout, even going so far in one presidential debate as to call for the taxpayers to buy off all the bad home loan debt on top of paying off the TARP. I'm guessing I wasn't the only conservative who was throwing things and screaming words a Christian man should never say at the television screen as Obama got to scold McCain for demanding too much from the taxpayers on national television. We've already written about not accepting the premise of your opponent, but the next step to winning requires borrowing a technique from the martial arts, using your opponent's strength against him. In political combat, we do that by first rejecting your opponent's premise, and then we reverse his premise and we use it against him. Or as Shakespeare put it in Hamlet, to hoist someone from his own petard. Now, Reagan was a Jedi master of this technique. Here are just a couple of many famous examples. During a 1984 presidential debate with Walter Mondale, Reagan responded to mounting criticism he was too old to be president by promising he would not, quote, make his opponent's youth and inexperience an issue in this campaign. That snarky retort even drew a laugh from Mondale himself. At a press conference during his first term, ABC News chief White House correspondent Sam Donaldson asked Reagan if all the blame for the recession at the time rested alone with the Democrat-controlled Congress. Mr. Reagan, does any of the blame belong to you? Donaldson asked the president. Without skipping a beat, Reagan winsomely replied, yes, because for many years, I was a Democrat. While there may never be another Reagan, Texas Senator Ted Cruz looks like the closest thing we've had since, there is no reason why we can't do a better job of hoisting the opposition from its own petard. But to do so requires some of that 3D thinking I referred to in the introduction. You cannot successfully reverse your opponent's premise if you accept it. And unless you know why you believe what you believe, you will accept your opponent's premise more times than not. In the first Reagan example we just cited, notice he rejects the premise outright that he's too old for the job. So instead of arguing his qualifications, he makes a crack, undercutting the qualifications of his opponent. But Steve, some of you will say, aren't we tired of politicians who won't answer the question they were asked? Yes, but if the premise of the question is flawed, you should never dignify it with an answer. Gotcha questions with no attempt to address anything substantive are the left's version of, did you beat your wife last night? Once you start going down that rabbit trail, you end up chasing your own tail. Instead, you need to reverse the premise and put them on the defensive. Let them know that it ain't no fun when the rabbit's got the gun. On the other hand, you also don't want to come across as evasive, which is why reversing the premise and using it against them is so key. You're turning the argument of your opponent around on them to demonstrate the total lack of substance and merit of their argument. In the second aforementioned Reagan example, he utilizes the second dimension of our 3D thinking perfectly, which is know why others believe what they believe. Reagan knew that Donaldson was a liberal. Therefore, Reagan knew that Donaldson was just looking for a gotcha question. He wasn't looking for a substantive discussion on what policies were necessary to get us out of the recession at the time. Donaldson was trying to get Reagan to use his bully pulpit to admit the recession he inherited from Jimmy Carter was his fault. That knowledge helped Reagan respond by taking Donaldson's premise and strangling him with it. Essentially, Reagan said, fine, Sam, you want me to accept blame for what big government does to stifle capitalism and free enterprise? Sure. I guess I should probably accept some of that blame for all the years I used to be a big government Democrat advocating these same failed policies myself. That, my friends, is what the kids today refer to as a walk-off shot or a mic drop. It's as automatic as Mariano Rivera coming out of the bullpen for the New York Yankees in the ninth inning to close the game. The crowd knows it's safe to head out early and get the jump on the Bronx Zoo on the way home. Good night and drive home safely. Unfortunately, most of my fellow grassroots patriots reading this are painfully aware that we have so few potential champions today capable of duplicating these examples. In a soundbite-driven society like ours, the ability to be pithy and potent while trying to persuade others to your principles is pivotal. Folks don't give you 30 minutes to make your case today. They barely give you 30 seconds. Since we communicate in such a quick draw style these days, it is imperative that we are quick on the draw in the arena of ideas. Whether it's a grassroots patriot standing up at a local Tea Party rally, one of our elected officials or candidates on a national stage, or just a conversation about politics between you and your neighbor, if you can't instantly grab the people's attention and make your case, they just move on. People are used to getting their news from Drudge's compilation of headlines and often don't read the actual article's length, or don't read beyond the first couple of paragraphs if they do. Instead of letters, we communicate with our family via Facebook status updates and with our friends in 140 characters or less on Twitter. Furthermore, the other side of the debate has already boiled down their positions to emotion-driven cliches that are easy to embed into the subconscious of our fellow Americans, i.e., a woman's right to choose, government investment, marriage equality, income equality, fairness, diversity, standing up for the middle class, etc. It's easier to communicate emotion in a pithy fashion than it is logic and reason, which is often what we base our positions on, so we're already at a disadvantage. That's why we need to be intentional about equipping one another to communicate in a way that resonates with how most of our fellow Americans receive and distribute information. One of the most effective methods of doing just that is to master the art of reversing the premise of our opponent's argument and using it against them. Let me provide a couple more examples from my own experience. I once did a TV interview where I sat in a chair and the host had 3 minutes to ask me anything that he wanted. This reoccurring segment was designed to put newsmakers on the defensive by forcing us to answer awkward or in-your-face questions off the cuff. I figured since I get to do this to newsmakers all the time, it's only fair that I put myself on the hot seat for a change. Since I'm not shy about airing my worldview, the host was aware of my socially conservative views, so he went for the jugular right away. Do you have any gay family members or friends, he asked. Now, this is the kind of question that normally makes us cringe after one of our so-called champions is asked something like this by the liberal media. The premise of the question is that people determine the moral standard, and not the moral standard itself. So if I have family members and friends who are same-sex attracted, and I live and let live with them, why don't I do this for others? After all, what's wrong with two people loving each other, right? Except I never accepted the premise of his question, and instead I turned it around on him. All of my friends and everyone in my family are either male or female, I told him. He looked puzzled and repeated his question. Everybody I know is male or female, I said. I'm not aware of a third variation of the human species, but if you discovered one, I'd get the patent on that research quick-like, because I'm guessing there's some money to be made there. At this point, it became clear he'd never run into anybody capable of doing this before, and was used to being the one framing the argument. Left with no liberal cliches to rely upon, he had to just come right out and say it now. Is anybody you know or care about currently having sex with someone of the same gender? He awkwardly asked. First, by never accepting his premise, I have forced him to accept mine, which is our gender is predetermined at birth, no matter what our desires and preferences are. Therefore, gender identity and sexual orientation are just Orwellian talking points devised to distract us from what we're really talking about here. Who someone wants to have sex with and how they want to have sex with them. This isn't about any virtue higher than men having sex with men and women having sex with women, despite the fact the anatomy of each makes that rather difficult on its own because the parts weren't designed to work that way. In addition, by making him ask his question this way, it looks like he's the one on a witch hunt and not me. Most Americans, regardless of political persuasion, have wrongly privatized sexual ethics. I heard from several people who saw the interview how they couldn't believe he was butting his nose into my private business like that. While I don't agree with that premise, I'm certainly more than willing to reverse it and use it against him. And when I did so, I went in for the kill. I don't make it a habit of calling my friends and family members and asking them who they had sex with last night, I said, as if their private sexual behavior was none of my business. Like Bill Paxton said in the movie Aliens, game over, man! The entire faulty premise of the homosexual agenda is that what two consenting adults are doing in their bedroom is of no business to anybody else. In reality, the motto of this movement is, you will be made to care. That's why they make it our business by invading the public policy arena, demanding validation for their private bedroom behavior in a manner that compels the rest of us to alter our morality and religious freedom to accommodate them. By forcing the interviewer to pester me to the point he had no choice but to abandon the liberal talking points and invade my family's privacy, I had reversed his faulty premise and used it against him. Even better, this all happened in less than 90 seconds, so it kept everyone's attention. After the interview, Dick Bott of Bott Radio Network, a legend in Christian broadcasting, called me to tell me that was about the best defense of our belief system in 3 minutes he'd ever seen. I was faced with a similar situation on another issue during a nationally televised interview I did during the 2012 presidential primary. I was challenged by the interviewer with how I, as a Christian, could talk about grace and love while at the same time argue to end government programs to help the poor and needy. Again, this is the sort of question that all too often the Mitt McCains and George McDole's face from the national media that produces that cringe-inducing response. But if you have a solid worldview, it's like sitting on a fastball with a 3-1 count. I think grace and love are measured in a culture not by how many people are in need of government assistance, but by how many people no longer do, I said. What can be more loving than encouraging your fellow man, created in the image of God, that with the right training, tools, and opportunity, they can rise above their circumstances and fulfill their God-given potential? There was no follow-up question after that. If the welfare state really meant compassion, then how come Democrats aren't bragging about the fact there are currently more Americans on food stamps than the population of Spain? Shouldn't they be thanking the taxpayers for all this compassion? Shouldn't they be holding press junkets to boast their plan is working and we're the most compassionate society we've ever been? Instead of screaming, swearing, and throwing things at the TV while Republicrats roll over and play dead for the liberal media, we'd be standing and applauding if more conservatives in the spotlight said things like this more often. Remember when Newt Gingrich got a standing ovation at the 2012 South Carolina primary debate when he turned the tables just like that on Fox News' Juan Williams? Now, one of the most devastating ways to deploy premise reversal is with the use of humor, especially of the snarky variety. I will often use stories going viral as an opportunity to hoist the left from its own petard. Case in point is the strange tale of Raymond Foley. The 59-year-old Foley was charged with, get this, chair wetting. After hours at work, he was urinating on the chairs of the women he found attractive. In response to this story, I opened my show one night with this monologue. Raymond Foley is a victim. Sure, in past eras far less enlightened and tolerant as this current gilded age. Foley might be considered a menace to society, a creep even. But we know better now, don't we? We know people just can't control their urges, and to demand otherwise is a Neanderthal concept right out of the Stone Age. Foley was born with something that compels him to act out in ways some segments of our society, still clinging to their guns and religion, condemn. But what Foley doesn't need is judgment. Foley needs understanding. Foley, 59, was recently charged with second-degree mischief for simply being who he is. Who is Foley? Foley is a chair wetter. According to police in Iowa, Foley was looking up his fellow females employees in the Farm Bureau company database. If he found the woman attractive, he would then go to her desk after hours and urinate on her empty chair. For months, several female employees were complaining about a strange scent emanating from their chairs. Eventually, it was discovered the smell was that of urine, and the urine was Foley's. Once forced to come out of the closet, Foley clearly felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders because he voluntarily surrendered to police. No longer having to hide who he is, Foley is willing to accept responsibility for his admittedly odd actions. We can only hope that Foley will simultaneously seek to raise awareness of them as well. That's because Foley is just the most high-profile example of the latest progressive form of self-expression. Foley, like an increasing number of Americans, has discovered that he has a urination orientation. Shamed by society, folks like Foley have been forced to act on their urges in the shadows. Whether it's urinating on empty chairs or perhaps overindulging their senses via depictions of urinations on adult websites, Foley and others like him are being denied their right to urinate. It is, after all, the way they were made. All of us have the desire to urinate. It's part of our base nature. But where does someone else get off, so to speak, telling someone else what form that urination must take? Or even where that urination must take place? Laws that deny public expression of urination are just another example of the government regulating what we do with our own bodies. Until these laws are repealed, and people like Foley affirmed in their right to urinate on whichever consenting adult or inanimate object they choose, none of us can trust our rights will be defended. For if one group is denied their freedom, then it's just a matter of time before straight shooters, slang for those who prefer to urinate into toilets, or on them, depending on their aim, they'll also be threatened. Some of you are sure to be offended by what Foley has done, but how dare you judge Foley until you've walked a mile in his shoes, or spent some time sitting in his chair? Besides, someone cannot change the way they were born, thus it's not right to shun Foley simply for acting on his nature. The chairs were empty, remember, and surely the urine dried by the time the women returned to work the next morning. Foley wasn't doing anything that harmed anybody else, and it's not like you can spread some disease via airborne urine. If that reasoned argument doesn't persuade you, then answer this simple question. How has Foley being able to act on his urination orientation negatively impacted your urination? If it hasn't impeded your stream of consciousness, so to speak, then what Foley is doing is none of your business, and you should urinate when and where you choose and permit Foley to do the same. Granted, the chairs Foley was urinating on were someone else's property, but that's simply because neither his employer nor the government provided the means by which Foley could properly apply his urination orientation. If Foley had access to chairs pretty girls once set in to urinate on, he wouldn't have to urinate on the chairs he actually did. That's not even addressing the fact that if the government doesn't provide Foley chairs to urinate in, he'll continue doing it after hours in chairs that could be faulty. Faulty chairs may collapse, thus putting Foley in jeopardy. We don't want people being harmed by collapsing chairs in back hallways, do we? That's exactly why the state ought to be providing those chairs for Foley and others like him. It could potentially save lives, not to mention some chairs, which is good for the environment. Then the state should make sure the next generation of kids in our schools doesn't succumb to the same intolerance and lack of diversity towards urination orientation that their fundamentalist parents and grandparents have victimized folks like Foley with. Furthermore, the company Foley used to work for should not only give him his job back, but also provide employees such as Foley a urination station to be utilized when the urge strikes. Of course, adding language to the company diversity curriculum, informing Foley's coworkers of the vital necessity of recognizing urination orientation in the workplace and the important contributions to society urinators have made throughout human history. Think of how many people in history have been bedwetters, for example. Should be immediate actions any good corporate citizen would immediately agree to. Given the fact a company like Farm Bureau would prefer to avoid looking like an agent of intolerance in the media, I'm confident it will do exactly that. Some of you reading this will bristle at recognizing both the normalcy and necessity of people like Foley being affirmed and accepted for just being who they are, but many of you also bristled at things 20 years ago you're readily accepting now. Nevertheless, even if those questioning or struggling with their urination orientation aren't accepted by your generation, rest assured they will be by your children once we're through enlightening them. Soon you will see more urination in your classrooms, and all of the best and most likable characters on your most popular television shows will urinate freely on screen. We'll even have clergy arguing that the Bible affirms urination in all of its forms. And we'll have a pioneer like Foley to thank for that. Who knows, maybe Sean Penn will even play the part of Foley in his biopic one day. D.L. Moody once said, "When you win some, you win some." In addition, there's an old saying which goes, "What the devil hates most of all is to be mocked." In one of my all-time favorite movies, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Captain Kirk gets his nemesis Khan to lose his cool and manipulates him into a trap by saying, "Khan, I'm laughing at your superior intellect." Making fun of the foolishness of the left's magical thinking by using their own premises against them wins people over to our side and also diminishes their credibility. Beyond the obvious double standard that exists, one of the reasons why liberal comedians get away with being more vicious than conservative commentators is because people find them funny. People let you absolutely annihilate your opponent if you make them laugh while you're doing it. What I have learned doing talk radio is that when I only go after our opponents using harsh language, I can at times offend even those who agree with me. But if I use humor, almost everybody gives me permission to be vicious, provided it's funny. If you make them laugh, it's almost as if the public gives you permission to swing away. But to be able to use humor and snark, that effectively requires an inner joy. And that inner joy comes from only a deep, abiding faith that, no matter what, God is still on the throne. The more I've grown in my faith, the more I believe my heavenly daddy can beat up their earthly daddy. The more I believe my daddy can beat up their daddy, the more peace I have about the future. The more peace I have about the future, the easier it is for me to relax and not always react emotionally. The easier it is for me to relax and not always react emotionally, the easier it is for me to find the humor or joy in all but the most tragic of circumstances. And the more I can use humor to make my point, the more likely I will get my point across.
And that was the Rules for Patriots. Back in a minute. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.